Good morning.
Founded in 1950, Bandai became the leading toy maker in Japan as they possessed the licenses to many popular Japanese franchises, ranging from long-running anime series like Dragon Ball and Gundam to live-action juggernauts like Godzilla and Power Rangers. The company has a history in many forms of media entertainment, including video games. While the majority of their video game output wasn't usually regarded as exceptional or worthy of anything above a cult following, it was still an incredibly lucrative market to Bandai because of the large catalog of properties they had at their disposal. In 2005, it was announced that Bandai would merge with longtime video game developer and arcade manufacturer Namco to form Namco Bandai Holdings Incorporated, the third largest game and toy company in Japan, behind only Nintendo and Sega Sammy Holdings Incorporated. Bandai previously considered merging with Sega back in 1997, but dissent between the two managements caused this to eventually fall through. If it hadn't, the fates of Namco and Sega as video game developers in the coming years could have been drastically different. During this transition, development continued for many of Namco's core game franchises, including the Tekken series. Katsuhiro Harada and Yoichi Yonemori were left to share the role of directors, while the team in charge of the soundtrack remained more than 20 strong. With the announcement of the PlayStation 3 from Sony, it was expected to become the next logical platform for Tekken 6, so Namco's newest arcade system board was once again based on the latest PlayStation architecture, entitled Namco System 357, which would only be used on Namco-developed games. Tekken 6 was revealed to be in production as early as 2005 during E3, when it was announced as an exclusive to PlayStation 3. The game was briefly shown again in a trailer the following year, where it was still being promoted as a console exclusive, though none of the footage in this video would ever be seen again in the final game. It wasn't until 2007 when Tekken 6 released in arcades, but fans expecting to play it on consoles would have to wait 2 more years. Tekken 6 took advantage of a proprietary physics engine that allowed for smoother and more realistic animations over its predecessor. Customization options introduced in Tekken 5 were expanded upon, with certain items being capable of inflicting damage to an opponent. Walls and floors could still be broken, but can now lead to new areas, as there were stages with multiple tiers. The new bound system granted characters certain moves that, when performed during a juggle, caused their opponent to bounce off the ground and allow them to extend their combo for more damage. The new rage system would make a character inflict more damage to their opponent when their own vitality dropped below a certain point, indicated by a glowing life bar. The game's story follows the events of Tekken 6, where series protagonist Jin Kazama has taken over his grandfather Heihachi's business conglomerate and initiates a large-scale war with the entire world. Alongside 35 returning favorites, the 4 new playable characters joining the roster included Zafina, a woman of presumably Egyptian descent, the German fighter Leo, the Spanish matador Miguel, and the heavy-set martial artist Bob. While Jin Kazama is set up to be the villain of Tekken 6, there are also 2 large-scale bosses in the form of a security robot codenamed Nancy and a creature known as Azazel, who's said to be the source of the devil gene within the Mishima bloodline. The following year, Tekken 6 received a substantial arcade update called Bloodline Rebellion. In addition to further balance changes and enhancements to the bound system, 2 more characters were added to the roster, consisting of Lars Alexanderson, a military soldier who is the illegitimate son of Heihachi Mishima, and Alisa Baskanovich, a jetpack and chainsaw-wielding fembot with detachable body parts. This update to Tekken 6 would be the version to come to home consoles in 2009, and the first game in the series to have a simultaneous release on the PlayStation 3, PlayStation Portable, and breaking from tradition, the Xbox 360. The Tekken Force minigame made a return in the form of a heavily expanded mode called Scenario Campaign, which focused on the adventures of Lars and Alyssa, but allowed players to take control of anyone from the roster. By this point, Tekken 6 was probably the game in the series known to be in development the earliest, as it was promoted years before it became available in a playable state. So when it finally released on consoles, it expectedly built onto the series' existing framework with new moves and characters, but unless players were willing to take the time to discover all of it, everything else about the game was seen as a little underwhelming. There were shared criticisms like its noticeably long load times and unfavorable online multiplayer at launch, but the decision to have the scenario campaign be the main highlight was not a good choice, as it was plagued with repetitive encounters, uninspired gameplay, and a lackluster storyline. That's not to say Tekken 6 was poorly received, however. The same time-tested mechanics and systems featured in Tekken 5 were expanded upon in 6, which was more than enough to satisfy hardcore fans of the series and give them something new to master with their character. But Tekken 6 wasn't in the same position as Tekken 5, where it needed to be better than the last one to stave off naysayers and becoming irrelevant. It's just that by now, it felt as though the developers were making a game strictly for fans who were already willing to invest more time with the game, or at least had enough competition to keep things interesting. To everyone else though, Tekken 6 came off a little too familiar and generally unsurprising. 2009 was also the year that Capcom released Street Fighter IV on home consoles, and, in the eyes of many players, helped reinvigorate the fighting game genre. This momentum was especially bolstered by the company hiring prominent members of the community like Seth Killian to oversee development, and producer Yoshinori Ono becoming the new figurehead for the series. While Ono had already had a long history of working on different games at Capcom, his infectious personality on display during Street Fighter IV's promotion caught the attention of many fans. Tekken director Katsuhiro Harada had known of Ono for more than 10 years by now, and became friends with him only recently. Despite being complete opposites of each other, the two of them became notorious for a lot of their public antics whenever one of them had a new game to promote. Just as Ono was becoming a public face for Capcom, so was Harada when it came to Namco, as he made more public appearances when promoting Tekken alongside a number of his colleagues, such as fellow game designer Michael Murray, who served as his translator, and former competitive Tekken players Rich Bantegi and Mark Julio. Harada had been a longtime fan of Street Fighter, as was Ono when it came to Tekken. Over dinner together, they conceptualized a collaboration between Capcom and Namco, where each company would be given a chance to design a fighting game using the other's respective franchise. In 2010, Capcom announced the first collaboration in the form of Street Fighter X Tekken, which released 2 years later and was designed by the same development team behind Street Fighter IV. There was a 55-character roster filled with Street Fighter veterans and Capcom's interpretation of many Tekken characters. The game featured a tag team foundation similar to Tekken Tag Tournament, but with mechanics normally found in Capcom fighting games. Meanwhile, there was news of the next installment of Tekken in the form of Tekken Tag Tournament 2. The franchise continued to expand its reach with a new release planned for the Nintendo 3DS, and a CG animated film from the same company behind the series' cinematic cutscenes. The same directors for Tekken 6 were back, though the soundtrack team was noticeably scaled back, and consisted primarily of series veterans remixing a lot of classic tunes. The arcade system board had also been upgraded to Namco System 369, with specifications more in line with the slim models of the PlayStation 3. Tekken Tag Tournament 2 was released to arcades in 2011, and to tide fans over waiting for an official console release the following year, Tekken Hybrid came out on PlayStation 3 that same year, and included a demo of Tag 2 with a handful of playable characters, the recent CG animated film, and an HD remaster of the first Tekken Tag. Tag 2's new game engine rebuilt all the characters with visually sharper models and allowed for more of them to be featured on screen at once. Stages also featured more interactive elements where characters could have debris or moisture appear on their clothing in real time. The mechanics were similar to the first tag team game, with many of the features added from other installments over the years up to Tekken 6, and adjusted to take advantage of the two-character structure for more combo opportunities. For instance, Tekken 6 Bound system evolved into the Tag Assault system, where a player's second character could jump in to extend a combo at the cost of restoring lost health, or the Tag Crush system, where the second character can swap in safe from damage at a similar expense. In 2012, the game received another update called Unlimited, which, alongside balance updates and more custom items, allowed players to choose between using a tag team or a single fighter, and enabled up to 4 simultaneous players. Once again, this updated version was the one released on home consoles, where there were even more characters added, and even a stage featuring rapper Snoop Dogg, who wrote an original song called Knock 'Em Down. As Tag 2 brought back almost all the characters from prior Tekken games, the roster was easily the largest in the series' history, at nearly 60. Alongside long-absent fighters like Jun Kazama and Dr. Boskanovich, there were slight variations to some characters like a slim version of Bob, Lily's butler Sebastian, or Julia Chang's wrestler alter ego. There was a new extensive practice mode called Fight Club, and support for stereoscopic 3D televisions. Tag 2 also had an option to play custom music throughout the game, with cutscenes and music from prior Tekken games available through DLC. When Tag 2 was ported to the Wii U as a launch title, it brought back the Tekken Ball minigame last seen in Tekken 3, and various costumes and items inspired by Nintendo franchises like Super Mario and The Legend of Zelda. Just like with Tekken 6, Tag 2 was initially received very well. It wasn't an overhaul to the franchise, but it wasn't trying to be. There was plenty of content for newcomers and returning players to either have fun or learn to master, but over time, the multi-layered gameplay mechanics of Tag 2 became a daunting challenge for those who wanted to experience the game at high-level play. Some of the dedicated even had trouble learning all the different variables when it came to all the characters and how they each worked around the game's tag system. As with its predecessor, the game was the type that really shines when playing against like-minded opponents similar in skill. Everyone else was more than likely to walk away feeling overwhelmed at everything that's being offered to them right at the start. The following year came the surprise announcement and release of Tekken Revolution, a downloadable free-to-play game exclusively for the PlayStation 3. This game reused many assets from Tekken Tag 2, but only offered half of the game's roster over a period of time. Players had a small starting roster while additional characters had to be unlocked through a progression system. New characters to the series were added through a fan vote like the female vampire Eliza, who suffers from narcolepsy. Completing matches earned players skill points that could be used to upgrade the stats of a chosen character. New mechanics to the series were introduced like special arts and critical arts, while past features like the bound system were removed. Tekken Revolution was a new endeavor for the series, but its free-to-play nature meant it was plagued with pervasive microtransactions and made worse by its tendency to become unbalanced. The game stayed active for millions of players until the servers shut down in 2017. Fighting games had their humble beginnings and arguably most significant evolutions in arcade centers, but advancements in home consoles and network infrastructures over the past decades have made those origins feel like a distant memory to many introduced to the genre today. The oldest titles experienced the struggle firsthand when transitioning to 3D and then again when designing a product for a console-based consumer, which came with its own unique challenges. Tekken is one of those rare franchises that's managed to survive during all of this, with numerous successful entries and, as a result, has one of the largest and oldest fan bases. In the past few years, with franchises like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat both experiencing a sort of reinvigoration among its fans, Katsuhiro Harada has often been asked how Tekken had been affected by this new movement, to which he usually responds by saying that his series has always remained consistent with impressive sales numbers to back it up. That response inevitably begs the question as to why Tekken doesn't get the same recognition for its accomplishments as its long-running competitors. Tekken's place among fighting games today can be best understood by looking at the audience it's garnered and the people who make them. For instance, games like Street Fighter had been proclaimed as revolutionary since its early years, but even that couldn't stop it from facing the risk of extinction for a long period of time. In many ways, it was saved through the passion of those who grew up alongside it and didn't want to see that legacy end. Over time, that same passion has given rise to many players known all over the world, either from their inspiring high-level play, or simply as another's introduction to the series or to have a better understanding of the games these veterans have known about for years. Games based around communities like fighting games tend to have those so-called figureheads and personalities that serve as someone else's spark of interest to a particular title, and Tekken is no exception, though the faces its community would consider to be a leading voice are much fewer and disparate compared to games like Street Fighter and Smash Bros., which have thrived on their own gumption just as long without much public recognition. That's not to say that longtime fans of a particular series should have to feel obligated to indoctrinate all newcomers and get them up to speed, so to speak, but in an age where video games can live or die from having an active audience to consistently engage with, it's become an essential asset many companies have pursued to maintain growth. Nowadays, people watching others play a video game has become just as lucrative and vital to a game's lifespan as a regular customer purchasing a brand new copy from a store. But a community of dedicated players can only take a game so far, and the way games are designed can have a significant influence on the type of audience it invites. A game like Super Smash Bros. Benefits from being a game designed by Nintendo that anyone can pick up and have fun with, regardless of skill level. The same can be said for Tekken games, as someone who perhaps last experienced the series on the original PlayStation can have just as much fun playing the latest installment with their favorite character. But to dig any deeper is where an issue can arise. Similar to Tekken 3, when Street Fighter introduced its third numbered installment, the designers chose to wipe the slate clean by introducing a small roster of mostly original characters and new distinct mechanics for players to learn and master. But unlike Tekken 3, this resulted in the initial reaction towards Street Fighter 3 to pale in comparison to its predecessor. While these series of games is not considered one of Capcom's most successful titles, it has since become one of its most important historically, after players had invested the time to learn its intricacies. When the series received another numbered installment, installment after a long hiatus, the decision was made to forego building on the last one and instead hitting a so-called reset button, which led to the expected backlash among longtime fans. But in time, like before, the community became endeared to these changes as they learned its own intricacies and, in the process, gave prominence to newer or younger players from around the world introduced to the community through this particular entry. It's become a long-time tradition of Street Fighter to always wipe the slate clean at the beginning of a numbered installment, and to make incremental changes over time for players to discover or relearn. It's a design philosophy that flies in the opposite direction of a game series like Tekken, where, for years, every numbered entry has consistently built upon the foundation of the previous one. On the one hand, it results in each new game having a large starting roster consisting of returning characters fans are already familiar with. But on the other hand, it results in a player's expected understanding of the game's layered mechanics and nuances to logically increase, and become ever more daunting to those who haven't already devoted the time necessary to comprehend it all over the years and numerous entries. While not necessarily an impossible feat or essential task, it's still a challenge that becomes all the more difficult when there aren't people readily available to facilitate that process. Perhaps due to the nature of arcade centers in many countries today, the majority of top players when it comes to Tekken often originate from countries like Japan and South Korea, though it's also been reported that a substantial portion of the series' console sales come from Europe. Katsuhiro Harada has stated before how he'd want to make a fighting game where he can start again from scratch, but the other side of him that wants to just increase the current roster or add on another mechanic with every new installment is all that the series is known for. The problem with finding insight on a series like Tekken is the lack of available information from any of the designers, both former and current. Even as team members came and went during its early years, the core group of directors, composers, and designers on the series has largely been consistent since Tekken 3, and the majority of its development history has mainly come out through Katsuhiro Harada. The one notable exception was an interview by Yutaka Konoe, a former designer on Tekken who worked on the first 3 installments when development was at its most tumultuous. In the interview where he talked about the series, Konoe said the Tekken that emerged after he left has fallen below his expectations. To him, it's a lot easier to create arrangements of old games than to make something new. To still be relying on Tekken even now is proof that Namco's real strength has disappeared, and he's shocked by the decline in creativity and development ability. He considers it shameful to call oneself a developer or a creator if one can't design new games. Relying only on collaborations that will sell well shows a lack of imagination, and it's not going to set the world on fire. While his perspective comes off as a bit harsh, this has been a design approach seen not just with Tekken, but also Namco's weapon-based fighting game. Soul Calibur was one of the early trendsetters to 3D fighting games when it came to the Dreamcast, but each further installment placed a greater focus on its guest characters, and general public interest in the series eventually saw a decline as a result. So perhaps an element that could explain Tekken's designers always choosing a safe route is how they always want to please their dedicated fans and avoid any type of backlash like they had with Tekken 4 and Soul Calibur, especially when the financial risks are always getting higher. Ever since merging with Bandai though, Namco as a developer will probably never have to fear any kind of shutdown to their games business, since they've had access to a plethora of licensed properties for years now. Today, both new and old fighting games are in abundance, and there have been plenty of success stories when it comes to new development and distribution methods to warrant a prosperous outlook for the genre. The Namco that gave birth to the Tekken series is very different from the Namco of today, as its connection to Bandai has made the developer a reliable source for successful fighting games based around numerous anime properties or fellow publishers like Nintendo. The question of change or fondness for the old days when Tekken was once the bellwether for a generation of consoles will always loom over the series. But to dwell on such particulars would be ignoring the perspective Harada has always kept. Tekken has been successful enough in its lifespan to outpace many of its rivals by all kinds of metrics, and last more than 20 years thanks to its dedicated audience throughout that time, and it shows no sign of slowing down. The series may still have the baggage of being a known quantity in some aspects, but it's still a winning formula that's always proven successful to both its fans and its developer. And however the video game industry changes over time, Tekken will continue to thrive because it accomplishes something no one else can truly imitate or wholly replicate.